48 BC was a defining year for the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar annihilated the army of Pompey the Great at the Battle of Pharsalus, turning the tide of the ongoing Roman civil war in his favor, and forcing Pompey to flee to Egypt, which he sought to use as his new base of operations in the fight against Caesar. Caesar pursued Pompey to Egypt, finding that the forces of King Ptolemy XIII had unceremoniously murdered Pompey, which outraged Caesar. Not only that, but Ptolemy was also in violation of his father's will, of which Rome was the guarantor, which stipulated that he and his sister, Cleopatra VII, were to be co-rulers of Egypt. Caesar ordered both sides to disband their armies and meet in Alexandria to settle their differences. As famously told by Plutarch, Cleopatra would win Caesar's favor in a dispute by sneaking past her brother's soldiers into Alexandria, while hidden in a rolled-up carpet which her servant delivered as a gift to Caesar. The cunning, cleverness, and intelligence of one of the most famous women of antiquity utterly charmed Caesar. Cleopatra's beauty, as many often point out, was not in her looks, but in her intellect. She could speak a whopping 8 languages, such as Latin, Greek, Ethiopian, and either Hebrew or Aramaic. Most notably, she was the first member of the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, which had already ruled Egypt for 200 years, that could actually speak Egyptian. On top of that, she had proven herself as a capable political actor by surviving her brother's attempts to depose her from the throne. Caesar and Cleopatra developed a very intimate relationship, siring a son named Caesarion. Cleopatra traveled with Caesar to Rome after the Civil War, establishing herself as a power player in Roman politics. She was in Rome when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. After the Second Triumvirate won the subsequent Liberator's Civil War, she aligned herself with Mark Antony against Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra soon became lovers, beginning history's most famous romantic relationship. Their love and affection for each other was so strong that Octavian and his supporters used it as propaganda to slander Antony. They accused Cleopatra of using her immeasurable wealth and beauty to seduce Antony and manipulate him into giving her control over all of Rome's overseas empire, and potentially even Rome itself. By doing this, Octavian was able to frame his fight against Antony as that of a fight against a foreign invader, instead of yet another civil war, which the Romans were understandably growing tired of. As we all know, Octavian's forces crushed those of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, leading to a collapse of their power in the eastern Mediterranean, and eventually, their suicides a year later. Octavian's triumph marked the end of the Roman Republic. He adopted the name Augustus, becoming the first Roman emperor. Fears of a Cleopatran takeover of Rome turned out to be greatly exaggerated. But what if they weren't? What if in an alternate timeline, everything went perfectly for Cleopatra? What if Antony and Cleopatra not only defeated Octavian, but did so in a way that saw Cleopatra emerge as by far the senior partner in their relationship? How would the world be different? How would history change? There are a number of ways in which this could have happened. One of the key factors that led to Octavian's victory over the rest of the triumvirate was the military genius of Octavian's close friend, Agrippa. In 43 BC, after Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus divided the Roman provinces amongst themselves, it appeared that Octavian had gotten the short end of the stick. Not only were Antony's provinces far wealthier, but Octavian had to contend with Sextus Pompey, who seized control of Sicily and started attacking Rome's grain fleets, leading to famine in Italy. Octavian also at one point nearly lost control of Italy to Antony's wife and brother in the Pelusine War, only saved by the martial prowess of Agrippa. And it was Agrippa who Octavian had placed in charge of challenging Sextus's seemingly insurmountable naval supremacy. Agrippa built an artificial harbor inside a hidden lake in Italy to train a new navy, and built Octavian a powerful fleet from virtually nothing. Things could have easily gone wrong. There were times when Sextus almost completely defeated Agrippa and Octavian. In this alternate timeline, Agrippa lives long enough to secure Italy for Octavian in the Pelusine War, but dies sometime during the campaign against Sextus in a massive naval disaster. Without him, Octavian's strategy to contain Sextus becomes impossible. The blockade on grain to Italy continues, leading to an even longer famine that cuts away much of Octavian's remaining political influence. Having already been betrayed by Octavian before, there is no way Sextus negotiates with him again. At this point, Octavian's position would be untenable. There is no way to know if he would be lynched by the Roman mobs, ousted from power by Antony's political allies, or killed in conflict. But it doesn't matter. He's now out of the picture. Antony's political allies would likely become ascendant in Rome, and this new regime would have no choice but to give Sextus pretty much everything he wants in exchange for an end to the blockade. At the same time, in the east, just like in our timeline, Antony was mounting a massive military campaign against the Parthian Empire. In order to fund this expedition, he relied on food, funds, and supplies from Cleopatra. And, just like in our timeline, Antony would fail horribly in his war against Parthia, once more relying on Cleopatra's food, funding, and supplies to put a stopgap on his losses. In this alternate timeline, Antony would have to lose even larger numbers of men and supplies, enough to make his position extremely vulnerable. Such a situation would make Antony entirely reliant on Cleopatra's clout and resources to stay in power. In this kind of scenario, Cleopatra could foreseeably emerge as the senior partner in the relationship, with Antony giving even more concessions to Cleopatra than in our own timeline. In our timeline, after the disaster against Parthia, Antony attempted to reorganize the governance of the Roman East, centering everything around Cleopatra and Egypt. In what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony addressed each of Cleopatra's children in a lavish ceremony. He aspirationally named his first son of Cleopatra, Alexander Helios, as king of Parthia and Armenia. He named his daughter with Cleopatra, Cleopatra Selene II, as the queen of Cyrenaica, Libya, and Crete. He named his other son by Cleopatra, Ptolemy Philadelphus, as the king of Cilicia, Phoenicia, and part of Syria. He also declared that Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Caesar, was the true legal heir of Julius Caesar. Finally, Antony proclaimed Cleopatra to be Queen of Kings, a title that put her on par with the Parthian emperor. The strategy behind these moves was to create a network of loyal client kingdoms throughout the Roman East that would be dependent on their familial and financial ties to Cleopatra and Egypt. Since Caesarion, now declared to be a true Roman by Antony, was Cleopatra's heir, this meant that this whole network of interdependent dynastic alliances would technically still be run by Romans. In our timeline, Octavian and his allies in the Roman Senate prevented these plans from becoming law, falsely characterizing them as Antony giving up the entire East to a foreign monarch, ultimately leading to the final war between the two men. However, in this timeline, Octavian cannot do that, and the Donations of Alexandria are fully realized. Let's stop to take a look at the map right now. Sextus Pompey controls Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and possibly southern Greece, which had been originally promised to him by the Triumvirs in our own timeline before their falling out. Lepidus, having never been betrayed by Octavian after defeating Sextus, remains in control of the province of Africa. Antony and Cleopatra are undisputed hegemons of the Roman East. None of them are in a position to consolidate as much power in Rome as Octavian was in the original timeline. Antony and Cleopatra are just too far removed from Rome, and not nearly politically influential enough to name themselves as emperors of United Roman Empire, just as Octavian did in our timeline. Instead, Antony's political faction maintains a dominant, but not absolute, position. They can get most of what Antony wants done, but he is far from an absolute ruler of all Rome. But since in this timeline Antony is entirely reliant on Cleopatra's resources to maintain his position, this effectively makes Cleopatra a political kingmaker in the Republic's politics. Though the Senate would be reasserting itself, it would be hard for Rome to shake off the rampant corruption and disregard for the rules that plagued the past few years. By flooding Rome with her gold, Cleopatra would easily be able to bribe enough Romans to do her bidding, so long as she did not overplay her hand. Even without Octavian's anti-Antonian propaganda regime, Cleopatra and the Donations of Alexandria would still be seen extremely negatively by the Roman people, especially since Antony was elevating Cleopatra to the status of a monarch in charge of Roman lands, and was going further than that by giving a Roman the title of a king. Since this timeline assumes Cleopatra does everything right, that means she and Antony would know that. They would never personally set foot in Italy again, instead living out their days in Alexandria, which would become the capital of the Roman East. If they maintain this hands-off strategy of using money to control Roman politics from afar, they could stay in power for the rest of their lives. Cleopatra would not be able to conquer Rome through brute force, but she would be able to conquer it from behind the scenes, with her quintessential political maneuvering, bribery, and calculated political manipulation. It is likely that Rome would lose control of Illyria for several decades. In our original timeline, it took a massive and costly intervention by Agrippa to prevent the Republic from losing control of the province. Without him, Rome likely would have lost Illyria. War would probably inevitably break out again between Sextus Pompey and the rest of Rome. Sextus might act intelligently like Antony and Cleopatra are in this timeline, and try to maintain his good position in the status quo. But his desire to control southern Greece would undoubtedly put him at odds with Antony. Furthermore, there's little reason to think he would not try and leverage the threat of a blockade against Italy the next time a political crisis occurs. Perhaps it has something to do with the elections of a consul, tribune, or the passage of some other law in Rome. The reason doesn't matter, only that Sextus will try. Unfortunately for Sextus, there's no way he could emerge victorious against the combined forces of Antony, Cleopatra, Antony's allies in Italy, and Lepidus. Speaking of Lepidus, if a war between Antony and Sextus does occur, he would probably suffer the same fate as in our own timeline, demanding control of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, before being forced to retire after overplaying his hand. Now, as the years go by, we can start to see some really interesting historical ramifications take shape. It is unlikely that this hybrid Roman-Egyptian republic/empire would remain united long past the deaths of Cleopatra and Antony. There would be two competing centers of power, the Senate and the rest of the Republic's traditional institutions in the west, and the throne of Cleopatra's hereditary Egyptian-dominated empire in the east. This is a recipe for civil war. The Romans, at the time, still despised the idea of being ruled by a king, and hated the idea of any Roman claiming that title for themselves. That's why Augustus used the title of princeps instead of king. But of course, Caesarion was meant to legally be a Roman, the true heir of Caesar, who was the king of kings. This was a ticking time bomb that may have been able to have been swept under the rug while Antony and Cleopatra were alive, but not for much longer. All of these things would have made a split of the Roman world into two, an inevitability sometime in the 1st century AD. By this point, the East and West respective power centers and institutions would be so diverged that it is unlikely anyone would be able to reunite them in the resulting civil war. The split would be permanent. In this scenario, the West would likely remain a deeply flawed and corrupt republic, assuming they don't descend into their own series of civil wars and have a second wave of despotic Caesars and strongmen who eventually bring about the end of the republic. Over the centuries, this might be inevitable, but for at least in the 1st century, the Mediterranean is split between the Roman Republic in the west and the Hellenistic Roman-Egyptian Empire in the east. I think it is unlikely Parthia or any future succeeding Persian state would be able to take advantage of this early split. In our timeline, they fought a united Rome to a stalemate for centuries, and then continued to fight just the eastern half of Rome to a stalemate for several more centuries. It's unlikely anything would be different. It's difficult to know how Britannia and Germania would be affected by an early division of Rome like this. I would speculate that if the Republican system persists for at least a few more decades, many Roman generals could again try and leverage military conquest as an avenue to political power. They would definitely try and reassert control over Illyria at some point, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that an aspiring Roman general could see Britain as ripe for conquest. Even just speculating, it's impossible to really say what would happen to Germania between the Rhine and Elbe rivers. As the centuries march on, the divide between the Latin West and the Greek East would become even more stark in this timeline. The two sides would develop their own identities, and would lack any sense of shared heritage. The Roman East, in particular, would develop very different than our own timeline if the system put in place by the donations of Alexandria were to endure. Antony's approach to running the Roman East was obviously a lot more hands-off than how Augustus did things in our timeline. Rather than exerting hard power on their subjects, Antony and Cleopatra would seek to strengthen the dynastic and financial bonds of their client states, as Antony originally intended, likely creating an intricate web of marriages among their grandchildren and other local rulers. This meant that places such as Judea would maintain a lot more autonomy than they did in our own timeline. Herod the Great was an old ally of Antony before the Battle of Actium, and it is not unbelievable that Cleopatra's descendants may have eventually married into the Herodian royal family. This would preserve the Herodian dynasty and Judean autonomy for decades, if not centuries longer than in our own timeline. Direct Roman rule of Judea would not have happened as we know it. Of course, radical factions such as the Sicarii and Zealots may still arise and engage in revolts similar to those against the Seleucids almost 2 centuries earlier. But without direct rule, it is unlikely that something on the scale of the First Jewish-Roman War would have occurred. This means the Second Temple of Jerusalem would never have been destroyed. The Jewish exile would never have happened, and Rabbinic Judaism would never arise. However, I don't think this means that Second Temple Judaism would continue indefinitely to the modern day. We do have a parallel group of people who we can look at to see what would happen if the Jewish exile never happened: the Samaritans. For those that don't know, the Samaritan religion is nearly identical to Judaism, except that they believed the center of all worship should be Mount Gerizim, and not the temple in Jerusalem. During the times of Jesus, there were millions of them, almost as many of them as there were Jews. They never really established a diaspora like the Jews did, remaining in the Levant. Their numbers would eventually shrink to just 1,000 by today, as their members were either killed, Christianized, or Islamicized. Something similar would happen to both the Jews and Samaritans in this timeline. Speaking of Christianity, in this timeline it would either be unrecognizable or just not exist at all. Key pieces of Jesus' story, such as Pontius Pilatus and Jewish attempt for Roman domination, would be moved around and not present in Judea. Of course, there were so many messianic claimants and monotheistic religious movements that had their origins in this time period that eventually a religion would still arise that would fulfill the same historical role that Christianity did. It just may not be called the same thing or share a lot of the same religious canon. The same goes for Islam. A religion may arise that fulfills the same historical role, but the butterfly effect from so many pieces of Jesus and Muhammad's story being moved around will make it unrecognizable to an observer from our timeline. Something to consider is that if a religion like Christianity does arise, that means that the two empires would either adopt different forms of it, or one would not adopt it at all. I find it more likely that the Eastern Egypto-Roman Empire would preserve their polytheistic pantheons than the West, but it is possible that both may adopt different competing monotheistic religions. This would completely change the dynamic of the competition between this timeline's versions of Christianity and Islam. When the Western Empire inevitably collapses after a couple of centuries, if the Eastern Empire conducts a Justinian-style reconquest of the Western territories, it may lead to their religion taking hold in places such as North Africa and Italy. This would ensure that the Papal States, or anything that resembles it, would definitely not exist in this alternate timeline, even if the East doesn't invade Italy. Without the Papal States, the Bishop of Rome would have far less influence. Not only that, but he would never be able to crown a Charlemagne or Otto the Great type figure as Roman Emperor, meaning the Holy Roman Empire never arises, at least not as we know. Because of all this, Western Europe's alternate Christianity would be much more decentralized and likely diverge into competing sects much earlier in this timeline. Eastern Europe may still adopt the Eastern Empire's religion, but if the Eastern Empire never adopts a monotheistic imperial religion, Eastern Europe would likely remain entirely unchristianized, leading to pagan religions continuing to dominate. With Christianity so disunited in this timeline, many other European realms, such as those of the Vikings and Scandinavia, may either never Christianize or adopt competing Christian sects. Pagan religions would remain much more influential in this timeline. Religion as a whole in Europe would be much more fractured. Either way, with Christianity, Arianism, Manichaeism, and Islam all butterflied to the point of being unrecognizable, it is literally impossible to predict with any degree of certainty what may unfold in the far future. It's just a fun thought experiment to think about. But what do you think the future holds in this timeline? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe.